This is the LAMZU Thorn V2, the long-awaited refresh and update of the original Thorn that was released all the way back in October of 2023. Now, for those of you who watch the channel for a while now, you'll know that I love ergo mice and I try and review as many as I can, but the Thorn and LAMZU's other products have eluded me for quite some time now, meaning I never got to try any of their highly regarded ergonomic shapes, much to my dismay might I add. But finally, I was able to get my hands on the Thorn V2, and for this being my first experience with LAMZU's products and the Thorn series specifically, I'm very impressed, as not only is the mouse's quality, design, and performance fantastic, the mouse's specs and most notably shaping have been updated coming from the V1, and the adjusted shaping, while the differences are slight, not only feels great to use, it's coincidentally very similar to one of my all-time favorite ergo shapes, and this combined with the mouse's performance and all its other great attributes has made the Thorn V2 a very impressive mouse, so much so it's actually dethroned my main ergonomic mouse that I've been maintaining for the past year or so. So in today's video, we're going to talk in depth about the Thorn V2 and go over all its updated specs and components, the adjustments made to the shaping, its internal build, and we'll go over its improved performance, usage experience, repairability, and much more. But before we get started, a big thanks to LAMZU for sending the Thorn V2 over for review, and a massive thank you to all the channel members who support what I do here and make reviews like this possible. And as always, this review will be completely unbiased, meaning you'll get my honest opinions of everything I cover here on the channel, with no affiliate codes, brand buys, or paid promos. But without further ado, let's get right into today's episode of the mel0n Review. For testing parameters, since I had two versions of Thorn V2, I tested the pre-production unit for around 2 weeks and the retail batch unit for about a week, and both mice were used for both work and gaming use cases on soft and hard pad types. For skates used, I used all of the included skate types over my testing, but due to their material, once I finished testing them, I opted to use aftermarket skates that were more hard pad optimized since I use that pad type the most. And for firmware, both mice were tested on firmware version 0.0.1.12, the latest firmware available at the time of this review. And as a quick note, there is a slight difference between the pre-production and retail units I have here, as the pre-production unit uses a 250 mAh battery while the retail batch unit uses a 300 mAh battery. Aside from that slight change, both units are identical, and as such I'll be talking about both units interchangeably in this review, but for the battery section I'll be referring to the retail batch unit, not the pre-production unit. For versions, the Thorn V2 as of recording this review is available in 4 colorways. Black and red, which features a black shell with red buttons, orange, which features an orange shell with black buttons, white, which features a white shell with black buttons, and purple, which features a light purple shell and slightly darker purple buttons. All of these colorways retail for $129.99 USD or around $179.99 Canadian dollars, and in today's video we'll be covering the black, red, and orange colorways of the Thorn V2. For packaging, the Thorn V2 comes in a very premium type, arguably being the most premium packaging I've seen a mouse come in to date. And in addition to its premium feel and great aesthetics, on the box's sides and back it lists plenty of information about the mouse, such as the included accessories, the mouse's specs and dimensions, along with runtime estimates, what grip styles the mouse is best suited for, and more. Now to open the box, I have to slide off this little outer cover, and with that removed the box opens like a book, revealing 2 compartments. The first of which contains the mouse and its dongle, which are nested into little cutouts in the base foam. There's also a decent amount of protective foam on the box top here, but if the box is roughly handled or knocked around during transit, the contents can be displaced quite easily, which can potentially cause damage to both the mouse or the receiver, and as such I like to see LAMZU add foam pillars to the box top, similar to what other brands have done on their packaging, as that would help keep the contents in place during shipping and prevent any potential damage to them. Now thankfully on both of my units, the dongle and mouse were unscathed, even though they were both knocked loose during transit. And notably, LAMZU is using their new gen orbital receiver here on the Thorn V2, which is a notable improvement over their previous gen receivers, as it features an improved antenna architecture, customizable indicator LEDs, and a heavier 18.5 gram weight, which when combined with a decently sized rubber pad on its base, the receiver anchors itself decently well to desktops, but it still can be displaced by heavier cable types, so keep that in mind. Circling back to the the box, in the other compartment we'll find a small accessory package as well as a LAMZU branded drawstring bag, which is similar to the bags included with G-Will's mice, just a much higher quality, and inside it we'll find the mouse's user manual and another paper-like baggie. Now, I'm very happy to see this bag included here, as you can use it to not only transport the mouse if you don't have the box, you can also use it as a storage bag for the mouse, shielding it from debris buildup when it's not being used. Admittedly though, since the shell is solid, debris buildup isn't as much of a concern here as it would be on a mouse with a more open shell, but I'm still happy to see the bag included here regardless. And inside this paper-like baggie, we'll find the mouse's stock cable, which is a rather familiar typing, as we've actually talked about this particular cable type before, but that's a conversation for later in this video. Moving on to the mouse's user manual, inside it lists the mouse's buttons and their default keybinds, what the mouse's indicator LEDs correspond to, and it also repeats some of the same information that was listed on the back of the box. But unfortunately, it doesn't give much information about the updated receiver typing, but we'll go over its new features in a moment. Another disappointing aspect to this manual is that it doesn't include disassembly and or recycling instructions for the Thorn V2, which is quite disappointing, and hopefully the missing information here will be added to their future product user manuals. Now, circling back to the small accessory package we removed from the second compartment a moment ago, inside we'll find a sheet of grip tapes and 2 extra alternate skate types. Starting off with the grip aids, they're a unique typing, having a flower petal-like texturing across their surface, but the material isn't as sticky as I expected it to be, which does give these grip aids interesting performance, but we'll talk more about them later. And for the skates, in addition to the pre-installed half-size skates on the mouse's base, the mouse also includes a set of full-size skates which are the same layered typing as the ones pre-installed, along with a sheet of 20 dot skates, which are a traditional single layer typing. And as you can see, all the included stock skate options do have a blue protective film pre-installed over their surface, so be sure to remove this film before using any of the skate types. Now, all of the mouse's stock skates performed quite well, specifically the full-size set, as they're essentially identical to the mel0n SV3 stock skates and had the same surprisingly good performance. However, due to their material typing, their durability on hard pad types was less than ideal, hence why I opted to use aftermarket skate options over the majority of my testing, but we'll talk more about the stock skates performance, their pad compatibility, along with the mouse's aftermarket skate compatibility later in this video. And lastly, for warranty, the Thorn V2 has a standard 1-year manufacturer warranty, and you can find all the terms and conditions for said warranty over on LAMZU's website. Moving on to the Thorn V2's new orbiter receiver, as I just mentioned, there's oddly not much information about it on the mouse's product page or in the included user manual, and as such, I was initially quite confused about its functionality and features, but as it turns out, this receiver is very similar to the Razer Gen 2 Hyperspeed receiver. Now, on the front of the receiver, there are 3 LED indicators which are arranged in an orbit-like design, hence the orbiter naming, and in its default configuration, the outer ring reflects the mouse's polling rate, the middle ring represents the device's connection quality, and the central LED indicates the mouse's battery level. But in the WebDriver, you can adjust the functionality of each LED to reflect any of the aforementioned statuses as well as the mouse's DPI level, or disable them entirely. But oddly, there's no option to have one of the status LEDs reflect the mouse's profile or whether the mouse's competition mode is active or not, and hopefully in the future, support for these functions will be added to this updated dongle. Another notable oddity here is that the receiver's LEDs are quite dim on my unit, meaning that they can be tricky to read sometimes, unlike the LEDs on other brands' receivers. And this is another tweak I'd love to see LAMZU make here, as having an option to increase or decrease the brightness of the status LEDs would be another great improvement. Now, the connection quality feature does work, however, it seems that the rate at which the connection strength is measured is a bit infrequent, meaning that unlike Razer's receiver, the accuracy of the receiver here isn't as good, but to be fair, this isn't the biggest issue, as this feature only has real value if you use the mouse in a signal dense or high interference environment, but hopefully in the future LAMZU can update this particular feature to make it a little more accurate. Now, as I mentioned earlier, since LAMZU hasn't included any information about this dongle with the mouse or on its product page, understanding what the receiver's LEDs reflect and correspond to is quite confusing, so much so I myself still haven't figured them out fully, and to be honest, I'm quite confused as to why LAMZU isn't advertising the features of their updated receiver here, as well it's a little half-baked in its implementation right now. It has has a lot of cool features and a lot of cool potential, but as of right now there's essentially no information about it advertised by LAMZU, which is quite odd. But compared to their previous releases, this orbiter receiver is a great improvement, and while it's not as good as Vaxi's Gen 3 or Razer's Gen 2 receivers, it's still a solid upgrade, and I hope we see it return on LAMZU's future releases, just with a few tweaks, additional features, and of course proper documentation. As a preface to this segment, keep in mind that my units were sent to me directly by LAMZU, so take the build quality and QC of my mice with a grain of salt. But that said, for these being my first experience with a LAMZU product, I'm very impressed with the build quality of my Thorn V2s, as their outer shells are extremely rigid with no creaking or flexing anywhere on the mouse's top or base shells. Internally, the mice are also very well built, as it uses an internal support skeleton that LAMZU is calling their TAS skeleton, which is very similar to the internal support structures we've seen Logitech and Vaxi and several other brands utilize in the past, but despite its familiar design, it provides fantastic structural support to the mice, but it does make the internal design a little bit more complex, meaning that servicing the mice can be a bit tricky in some cases. But we'll talk more about the mice's serviceability later, and for the mice's PCBs, their design and soldering quality is good on both of my units with no issues from my inspections. Another notable change I wanted to highlight here is that unlike LAMZU's previous releases, all of which had open bases, the Thorn V2's base is a solid type, which is a great change in my opinion, as while hollow bases allow for lower weights, they can make mice more susceptible to debris issues, and as such I'm happy to see LAMZU use a solid base type here on the V2, as it prevents said potential issues, and hopefully they'll continue to use the solid base style on their future releases as well. Moving on to QC, just like the mouse's build quality, both my Thorn V2s are very well QC'd, as the main and side clicks along with the scroll wheels are very well implemented, most notably the main clicks and the scroll wheel though due to their updated components. The side clicks do feel good too, but they are a touch wobbly and they're a bit slippery due to their shaping, but we'll talk more about their overall implementation later. But overall, the build quality and QC of my Thorn V2 units is very good, much better than I expected it to be in all honesty, and hopefully see this level of build quality and QC carry forward onto their future releases. For weight, due to the altered shell and internal structural changes, the Thorn V2 is slightly heavier than the V1, as LAMZU is advertising the mouse as weighing around 55 grams, 3 grams heavier than its predecessor. Now, 55 grams might seem heavy compared to the many lighter symmetrical mice that dominate the market, but for an ergo mouse, this weight is within spec, especially given the mouse's larger size. But as is usual, even though it's not advertised, there is a plus minus 2 gram ratio attached to this weight spec, as is the industry standard. Now, weighing my unit, its base weight with no accessories or skates is 54.09 grams. With the pre-installed half-size skates of the mouse's stock form, the mouse's weight increases to around 54.82 grams as the half-size skates add around 0.73 grams. Whereas with 8 of the included dot skates installed in the mouse's base, the mouse's weight drops to around 54.34 grams as they only add 0.25 grams to the mouse's base weight. And lastly, with the full-size skates installed, the mouse's weight increases to around 56 grams as they add around 1.90 grams to the mouse's base weight. And if you opt to use the included grip aids on the shell, which you won't likely need to considering the shell's coating is so good, they add around 1.80 grams to the mouse's overall weight. As such, in the mouse's various configurations, the Thorn V2 will weigh anywhere from 54.34 to 56 grams, and this isn't including the weight of the grip aids, meaning that the mouse will be within the advertised weight spec as long as you include the plus minus 2 gram ratio and don't use the grip aids. Now, for an ergonomic mouse, the Thorn V2's weight is great, and considering the redesigned internal structure and the altered shell shaping, I'm quite surprised the V2 only weighs 3 grams more than the V1, and notably, the weight gives the V2 a somewhat hefty feel to it, obviously not to the same extent as heavier ergonomic mice in the 60 to 70 gram range, but the heftiness is enough to give the mouse that controllable feel you'd expect from an ergonomic mouse, which improves its usage experience and performance when compared to lighter ergonomic mice in my opinion. For axis balancing, the Thorn V2 is balanced quite uniquely for an ergonomic mouse, as instead of being centrally balanced like most ergo mice are, the mouse is balanced forward of its 62mm physical midline, being balanced roughly between the 65 to 75mm mark on its x-axis. And since the mouse's balancing is a wider typing, it contains both the mouse's sensor and the midline of the side buttons, which gives the Thorn V2 a very balanced feel in the hand, as since your grip style will naturally align itself with the x-axis balancing point, it'll roughly align itself with the sensor position and the center of the side buttons. And for the mouse's y-axis balancing, since the shell is ergonomic, as is traditional for this type of shaping, the mouse is centrally balanced on its y-axis, but only by a very slight margin, and as such this doesn't impact the mouse's feel in hand or performance. Now, for the Thorn V2 being an ergo mouse and a larger one at that, the mouse's balancing is very well executed in my opinion, and due to the adjusted sensor position along with the wider x-axis balancing range, the mouse does have a slightly faster feel compared to other ergonomic mice that have more traditional lower sensor positions, and the wider balancing also gives the mouse fantastic hand size and grip style compatibility, which we'll talk more about in a few minutes. And as a last balancing related note, the mouse's battery has been positioned in the mouse's mid to rear region of its shell, and due to this, if the battery's position is altered or it's replaced with a larger or smaller type, the mouse's balancing can be affected, so keep this in mind if you plan on modding the Thorn V2's battery. For the Thorn V2 shell profiles, looking at the mouse from the top down, we can clearly see the expected ergonomic shaping, as the mouse has a top and mid region that have similar widths, while the end region is a much wider, pronounced rounded typing, the profile commonly found on many ergonomic mice. Flipping the mouse over, we can see the true shell profile of the mouse, as it's a bit different from how it looked from above, as the shell's left side right from the front has a very pronounced tapering in it, while the right side shell left from the top has a more flattened profile, similar to how it looked a moment ago. And of course we can see the rounded rear typing we saw from above, but from this perspective we can see the more nuanced changes in its profile. Looking at the mouse from its sides, we can see that the shell is a very rounded top profile, having a more bulbous shaping than many other ergonomic mice, but notably the termination point of the hump is located slightly more rearly in the shell than we commonly see, and the curvature of the top shell is rather aggressive, as the forward region of the shell is very rounded and very steep, whereas the rear region, while not as aggressive in its curvature as the forward region, is still curved more aggressively than that of many other ergonomic mice. Looking at the mouse from the front, we can best see the curvature of the shell's ergonomic tilt as it peaks towards the shell's left side and gradually curves downward, terminating at the right side of the shell. But notably, despite its more rounded shell profile, the curvature of the top shell tilt is more gradual and less aggressive than the tilt seen on other ergonomic mice. Now initially this might seem like a negative, but the gentler sloping in combination with the more rounded shell profile actually gives the Thorn V2 a very comfortable usage experience, while also improving the mouse's hand size and grip style compatibility, but we'll talk more about that in a couple minutes. From the front, we can also best see the profiles of the side shells, which as we briefly talked about a moment ago, do differ quite a bit, as on the shell's left side right from the front at its top region, the shell has a rather aggressive outward curvature and a slightly rounded surface. This roundness flattens out almost immediately towards the shell's mid region, but the tilt stays the same, that is until you reach the mid region of the side shell, at which the tilt becomes much more aggressively inwardly tilted, creating the tapered indentation we saw earlier. And from the deepest part of this indentation, the side shell reverts its tilt to be similar to that of the forward region, and continues to maintain this until it reaches the rear region, at which the side shell inverts its curvature, melding into the wider, rounded rear region of the shell. Whereas in the shell's right side left from the front, the forward region of the side shell has the same slightly rounded angled profile found on the shell's opposite side, and while it still forms a tapering at the side shell's mid region, it's much less pronounced, and throughout the side shell's forward to mid region, with the exception of the slight indentation, the profile is much more consistent and flattened compared to that of the opposite side. And from the deepest part of the indentation, instead of flattening out as the opposite side shell did, since the side shell widens at this point, so does the side shell width, and it does so by inverting its tilt, melding into the wider rounded rear region of the shell. And lastly, looking at the mouse from the rear, here we can see just how wide the rear of the shell is, and we can also see the shell's ergonomic tilt maintains its rounded ridge-like shaping throughout the majority of the rear shell, only terminating at the hump's lower to mid region. Now, this tilt profile is admittedly pretty common on many ergo mice, but here the ridginess of the tilt is much more pronounced, which is something I wanted to highlight here, as while it looks normal for an ergo mouse, in the hand it feels quite different compared to other ergonomic shapes. For shaping, and as you can clearly see, and as we've talked about many times already, the Thorn V2 is an ergonomic mouse. However, despite it sharing a similar shape to the V1, LAMZU has made several alterations to the V2 shell, meaning not only has a different feel in the hand compared to the V1, it also changes how it compares against other ergonomic mice available on the market. And as expected for an ergonomic shape, the Thorn V2 is right-hand optimized, meaning it cannot be used ambidextrously, as left-handed grip styles won't be able to grip the shell comfortably or utilize the side buttons due to their positioning. Now, for the shell changes made here, LAMZU has extended the length of the shell by 5mm, they've also thinned out the mid-region of the shell by around 2mm, and they've also adjusted the termination point of the top shell's peak, moving it slightly forward and lowering its height by around 0.25mm. And with these changes in mind, moving on to the shell's updated dimensions, for length, the shell measures 124mm long. For height, at the forward region of the shell, it measures approximately 12.7mm tall, 42mm tall at its mid-region, and from the peak of the shell hump, it tapers downward as we talked about earlier, terminating at a raised seam between the top and base shells, which measures approximately 5.4mm tall. And for width, at the forward region of the shell, at its top, the shell measures approximately 60.4mm wide, while at its base it measures approximately 52.5mm wide. At the mid-region of the shell, at its top region, it measures approximately 59.3mm wide, while at its base it measures approximately 53.6mm wide. And lastly, at the rear region of the shell, at the widest part of the rear curvature, the shell measures approximately 66.5mm wide at its base. Moving on to comparisons against other ergo mice, compared to the Death Adder V4 Pro, which features a more pronounced peak in its top shell and a steeper ergonomic tilt, the forward region of the shell is also wider, which makes the V4's buttons much wider than the Thorn's. Moving on to the side shell profiles, the Thorn's side shell indentations and curvature is more pronounced than it is on the Death Adder, mainly due to the thinned out mid-region of the shell, which also makes the peaks of the Thorn's side shell more pronounced at its forward and rear regions, whereas on the right side of the shell at its rear to mid-region, the rounded flared is more pronounced, while at the mid to top region of the shell it's thinner than the V4. And lastly, the Thorn sensor position is quite different, as not only is the sensor more forwardly positioned than the V4's, it's also positioned slightly to the right, which is a notable change, and we'll talk more about why that is later in this video. And compared to the G Pro Superlight 2 Dex, surprisingly the shells are quite similar, more so than I expected, but the Dex has a taller top shell peak and a slightly more pronounced ergonomic curvature compared to the Thorn. However, the peak of the Dex's top shell is more aligned with its midline, whereas the peak of the Thorn's top shell is more rearly positioned despite the adjustments made to it, and the Dex also has a taller forward shell profile, which is more expected due to the dimensional differences between the mice. For side shell profiles, the left side of the shells are quite similar, with the only main difference being a slight variation in the curvature of the tapered indentations, and that the rear region of the side shell is slightly thinner than that of the Dex. Whereas on the right side of the shell, the side shells are almost identical, with the only difference being again some very slight variations in their curvature, but to a much lesser degree than the shell's opposite side. And lastly, the two mice's sensor positions, to my surprise, are almost identical, being positioned roughly the same in the mouse's y-axis, but just like we saw in the Death Adder V4 Pro, the Thorn sensor is ever so slightly rightwardly positioned on its y-axis, but only by a millimeter or so. Now, personally speaking, and as I alluded to at the top of this video, I find the updated Thorn V2 shaping to be very similar to that of the Vaxi Outset AX, which is my all-time favorite ergonomic shaping, even outclassing the Death Adder shaping funnily enough. As the Thorn, while it has a taller top shell profile and a more aggressive ergo tilt and is also longer, it shares similar widths and heights, and the side shell profiles are almost identical to the Outset AX, but most importantly, the Thorn has the benefit of a much more forward sensor position, which isn't exactly surprising considering our earlier comparisons. But in the hand, despite the differences between the two mice, the Thorn V2 feels like a slightly larger Outset AX to me, which is a welcome surprise as I've been searching for an Outset adjacent shaping for a while now, seeing as it's sadly been discontinued, and based on all the mice I've tried so far, the Thorn V2 is the closest analog I've found, at least in my experience, which is partially why I like this mouse so much, as the Outset adjacent shaping works extremely well with my larger hand size. And on that topic, let's talk about the mouse's contact areas and points next. As a preface to this segment, due to the more gradual top shell tilt we mentioned earlier and in conjunction with the shell's wider, more bulbous shaping, this mouse provides a much wider contact area for your hands than traditional ergonomic shells do, meaning that the mouse will fill your hand more so than many other ergonomic mice, as it fills more your palm so to speak, the exact same thing we found in the Vaxi Outset AX, which also shared a similar rounded bulbous shaping. Now, for my 25.4 by 10.16 cm hands using a Tote claw grip here on the Thorn V2, V2. The shell makes contact with my thenar's mid to high region, my mid palm's mid to high region, and all regions of my hypothenar, and due to the wider contact regions here, instead of the traditional primary and passive contact areas we've seen on other mice, all regions of my palm serve as the primary contact point here on the V2 shell, allowing for a very locked-in, controllable feeling when using the mouse, even with my larger hands. Moving on to finger contact with my tilted claw grip, starting with my thumb in its natural position to rest at the upper forward region of the mouse's left side, a few millimeters forward of the side buttons, but if needed I can tilt my thumb inward to rest it at the deepest part of the side shell's natural indentation if more control over movements is needed. For my index and middle fingers, they rest toward the end region of the main clicks, but due to the slight grooving in their surface, this guides my fingers to rest towards the middle of the button's surface. Next, my ring finger rests roughly opposite the position of my thumb on the mouse's right side, and my pinky finger rests slightly below that, right around where the side shell starts to flare out to form the rounded rear shell curvature. But keep in mind I have very large hands and use a tilted grip style, so the way my hand interact with the Thorn V2 shell won't be the same for everyone, but you can use my contact regions and points as estimates for how the mouse's shell will feel in your hand and with your specific grip style. Moving on to the estimated hand size and grip style compatibility for the Thorn V2 here. On the product box, as we mentioned earlier, LAMZU is advertising the mouse is best suited for palm and claw grips, but on the product page they also advertise fingertip grip as being compatible, which is an interesting addition considering the mouse's size and weight. Another odd thing I noticed on the product page is that LAMZU claims the mouse isn't compatible with smaller hand sizes below 17.5cm according to them, but as we see in a moment, the mouse still can be utilized with smaller hand types, but only with some grip styles. And as I mentioned earlier, keep in mind the Thorn V2 is right hand optimized, meaning the mouse cannot be used ambidextrously as it's very uncomfortable to grip, and the side buttons can't be utilized with a left-handed grip style. Now for hands measuring approximately 12.5 to 14.7 by 5 to 6.5 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for palm grips. For hands measuring approximately 14.7 to 15.2 by 6.5 to 8 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for palm grips again. For hands measure approximately 15.2 to 16.5 by 8 by 9.5 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for palm grips again. For hands measure approximately 16.5 to 17.8 by 9.5 to 10.5 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for palm and claw grips. For hands measure approximately 17.8 to 19.1 by 10.5 to 11.5 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for palm and claw grips again. For hands measure approximately 19.1 to 20.3 by 11.5 to 12.5 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for claw and fingertip grips. And lastly, for hands measure approximately 20.3 to 21.6 by 12.5 to 13.5 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for claw and fingertip grips again. Now, as a note here, while the mouse is usable with smaller hand sizes, you'll be forced to use a palm grip, which will impact usability for some users, especially compared to the Thorn V1, but in its current state, the mouse is definitely best suited for medium to large hand sizes, but hopefully we'll see a mini version of the Thorn V2 released in the future, so smaller hand sizes as well as users with a fingertip or hybrid grip style have a more optimized version of the Thorn V2 to use. And also on the topic of fingertip grip is compatible here with the Thorn V2. Now I will say it's a little more friendly to fingertip grip due to the more unique ergo style shaping here, but it still can feel a little awkward to use with this grip style as is common for ergonomic mice. But if you're accustomed to fingertip gripping an ergo mouse, you can utilize it here. Just keep in mind the heavier weight which might impact this grip style's compatibility as well. And as always, keep in mind the listed hand size and grip style compatibility here is estimates, and as such the mouse's actual hand size and grip style compatibility will vary from person to person. But if you want to see if your hand size is compatible with the Thorn V2, I'd recommend measuring the length of your hand from the tip of your middle finger to your proximal wrist crease, and the width of your hand by measuring the width of your knuckle excluding your thumb. And you can take those measurements and estimate if your hand size and your grip style will be compatible with the Thorn V2. Moving on to coating, this is one aspect of the Thorn V2 that really impressed me, as the shell's coating is stellar and is one of the best coatings I've used this year, but since I've never used any of LAMZU's products before, I'm unsure if this is the same coating type they used on their previous releases or if it's a new typing, but regardless, the coating here in the Thorn 2 is very good. Now, LAMZU is advertising that the mouse's coating is a nano coating type, which is described as being skin friendly and most notably offers enhanced sweat grip, which is something I'm particularly interested in giving my sweatier hand type. Now, to the touch, the coating, as you might have guessed, has a matte rubberized feel to it, feeling almost identical to Razer's coating, specifically the black version. This is a very good thing, as Razer's coatings are one of, if not the best coating types you'll find on the market, and while other brands have come close to mimicking it, LAMZU has gotten the closest by far, as when comparing my black and red Thorn V2 to the Black Death Adder V4 Pro, the coatings feel essentially identical. But as expected, depending on the mice's colorway you choose, the feel of the coating will change slightly, as the coating on my orange colorway feels slightly more chalky, more similar to that of Razer's white coating, but even with this slight textural difference, it has the same fantastic performance. Now, to be clear, the textural differences between the coatings here are expected, so this isn't an issue by any means, but keep in mind that different colorways of the Thorn V2 will have a different textural feel, as the darker versions will have a more rubberized feel to them, whereas the lighter versions will have a more chalky feel to them. But regardless of the textural differences here, the coating on both of my Thorn V2 units performed amazingly over my testing and provided great anchoring and gripability even with my sweatier hand types, which is something I personally really appreciated, as I found other coating types to be a bit slippery at times, but the coating here was solid and performed very consistently. However, while this coating is great, it has the same trait of all good coatings, where it collects debris such as dust, dead skin, oils, and sweat, and other debris types like a magnet does metal, meaning that darker colorways of the Thorn V2 perpetually have a grimy look to them. Now, you can remove this by wiping the mouse with a dry microfiber cloth, but once you pick it back up again, the grime returns. As such, if you're particular about the aesthetics of your mouse, I would highly recommend getting the lighter colorways, as they hide debris buildup of the coatings much better than the darker colorways do. But regardless, the coating here in the Thorn V2 is fantastic, and again is one of the best coatings I've used this year, so much so I don't think anyone would feel the need to use the included grip aids on the mouse, but LAMZU included them regardless, so let's talk about them next. Moving on to the included grip aids, the Thorn V2's grip aids are the traditional full-size typing, the same style we commonly see included with many mice, which uniquely feature a floral-like texturing on their surface, but the material is a denser rubber typing, which to my surprise isn't particularly sticky to the touch, meaning that the grips won't have that super sticky, grippy feel you'd expect grip aids to have. But despite this, the texturing on them does provide a decent degree of gripability, which is good for dry hand types. However, if you have a sweatier hand type, the grips unfortunately do become rather slippery. For form factor, the grips are on the thinner side, meaning they won't alter the mouse's shape by a significant degree when applied, but the thinner design does mean the grips will warp if removed, so be mindful when installing them, as repositioning the grips can warp their shaping. Sadly though, the grips only include click covers and side covers, which is a bit disappointing, as I would have loved to see universal grips included here, such as some universal dots, hump covers, and side button covers. But as we just talked about, since the shell's coating is so good, I doubt many users will ever find the need to use the included grip aids here, so the lack of universal pieces isn't the biggest issue, but regardless, on LAMZU's future releases, they should try and mimic the design of G-Will stock grip aids, as they're not only made of a stickier material, they're modular and include a variety of universal pieces, hence why they're the golden standard for grip aids in my opinion, and hopefully on LAMZU's future releases, we'll see them include a more modernized type of grip aids with their products. For main clicks, the Thorn V2 uses a similar click style to the Thorn V1, but notably there have been some modifications made to the buttons and their internal components. But before we talk about the internal changes, let's talk about the altered buttons themselves. Starting off with shaping, the V2's buttons have a very curved design due to the top shell's more rounded profile, and due to the ergonomic shaping in the top shell, the buttons unsurprisingly have a tilt to them. But to my surprise, the tilt on the buttons isn't as pronounced as I expected it to be given the top shell's profile, as the end regions of the buttons are more flattened and share similar heights, differing significantly from the more uneven button design we commonly see on other ergonomic mice, being more akin to the main click style found in many asymmetrical mice, just with a very slight tilt to them. This unique shaping gives the V2's main clicks a much safer feeling in the hand despite their rounded, steeper design. On top of their unique shaping, LAMZU has also implemented a very slight grooving in the button's end to mid region, being a similar style to the groovings found found in the GPX2 and Super Strike's main clicks. Now, this indentation, due to its shallower design, somewhat guides your fingers to rest in the center of the buttons, but only if your fingers make contact with the button's end to mid region, as at their top region there's no indentation and thus no guidance. Now, if the Thorn V2 was a more traditionally shaped ergonomic mouse, I critique the shallower grooving style here more, as traditional ergo mice commonly feature much more pronounced indentations in their clicks to counteract the more aggressively tilted shells and clicks. But due to the button's unique, safer shaping and gentler shell tilt, there's really no need for a more pronounced grooving here in my opinion, and even though the main clicks do have a safer feel to them, they still are slightly tilted, and the very shallow grooving here does completely negate that entirely, which is nice to see, although the grooving isn't entirely needed due to the button's safer design. And on the topic of the button's gripability, the main clicks share the same coating as the rest of the Thorn V2's shell, which is great to see, as due to the coating's aforementioned fantastic performance, it makes the buttons very grippable and allows for solid finger anchoring on all the button's regions. Obviously more so in the end to mid region than the top region due to the aforementioned indentation, but regardless the buttons are very grippable, which is great to see. And another great attention to detail here on the V2 is that both the main clicks are indented into the mouse's side shells, quite significantly might I add, meaning that both the clicks will be free of any click interference issues with most hand sizes and grip styles, as the only way there'd be possibly interference is if your fingers rested against the seam between the buttons and the side shell, but seeing as this is highly unlikely, click interference issues should be non-existent here on the Thorn V2 with most hand sizes and grip styles, which is great to see. Moving on to click height, since the shell's ergonomic, the shell buttons do differ in height, but only by a slight margin, at least in their end to mid region, due to the shell's unique ergonomic tilt. Now, starting with the left click, at its end region, the button measures approximately 16.9mm tall, at its mid region it measures approximately 29.1mm tall, and at its top region, the button measures approximately 39.8mm tall. Whereas on the right click, at its end region, the button measures approximately 14.8mm tall, at its mid region it measures approximately 27.8mm tall, and at its top region, the button measures approximately 36.8mm tall. And for the click's audio feedback, here's a quick sound test of the Thorn V2's main clicks. Now, for the main click switches, LAMZU is advertising that the Thorn V2 is using optical switches, and I initially expected to see mel0n, FE, or ratio switches inside the mouse, but to my surprise, they've opted to use Kale optical switches, which is a unique decision given these switches' unpopular nature, but despite this, to my surprise, they're actually very well implemented. For specs, these optical switches are rated for a cycle rating of 150 million cycles, and have an estimated actuation weight of 60 plus minus 10 gram force, which is fairly accurate on my units, as at the button's end regions their actuation weight is around 60 gram force, while at their mid region it's around 65 gram force, and at their top region it's the heaviest, being around 70 gram force. But to be clear, this is expected, as every mouse's main clicks become heavier at the mid to top regions, so this isn't an issue by any means. But it's nice to see that the button's actuation weight matches the factory spec of the switches here in the Thorn V2, and it gives the buttons a great feel to them. But I wanted to highlight that these switches do differ from more traditional optical switches a bit, as instead of having that loud plinky sound commonly associated with this switch type, such as that of mel0n or ratio switches, while these Kale switches still have a degree of plink to their feedback, they're dulled slightly, having a similar sound to that of an FE optical. The switch's click feel also differs, as compared to mel0n switches, which have a very clean, crisp feel, these Kale switches have a more resistant, heavier feel to them, which gives them a very different feel than expected for an optical switch, being more akin to the feel of a mechanical switch, oddly enough. But seeing as we've seen other optical switch types such as FEs and ratios have a similar click feel to this here, this is to be expected somewhat, but regardless of their unique feel, the switches here do feel great, and I actually really like their unique feel, but this is definitely something to keep in mind if you're considering the Thorn V2, as its optical switches do differ from what you'd expect a traditional optical switch to feel like. Moving on to stabilization, both the main clicks are extremely well stabilized, only having a very very slight degree of play to them even when actuated, but due to the button's angled nature, if you press on their edges, there is a very slight degree of wobble to the buttons, but this is to be expected. But this isn't an issue, as the grooving of the button surface does guide your fingers toward the middle of the buttons to actuate them, so you won't likely ever experience this slight side wobble unless you click at the button's top region. For travel, both main clicks have a low to medium degree of both pre and post travel, falling into the low range with lighter actuations and the medium range with heavier actuations, and even with the longer pre-travel here with heavier actuations, both buttons have a very snappy rebound to them, which makes them feel very responsive and spammable. And for debounce, the Thorn V2 does have a filter range of 0 to 15 milliseconds, but as expected for an optical switch, this has been defaulted to 0 milliseconds. But if you experience double clicking or other issues with the switches over the lifespan of the mouse, you can increase this filter as needed to filter any inconsistencies. Another notable detail of the main clicks here is that LAMZU has pre-lubed the stabilizers, which helps to prevent grinding or uneven actuation weights, but the lubing on my two units is a bit thin, and as such, if you ever experience any of the aforementioned issues, I'd recommend re-lubing the clicks, which is pretty easy to do. And if you want to learn how to do this and service the rest of the mouse, get subscribed so you don't miss the Thorn V2's teardown video. And uniquely, the Thorn V2 also sports an optional speed click algorithm, which is an odd feature to see on an optical switch type, as speed modes are more commonly found on mechanical switch types such as SPDT switches. Now, funnily enough, technically speaking, optical switches can support SPDT, but in a very rudimentary form, so I don't think a speed algorithm is that. It's more likely just some tweaks to make the switches more sensitive or to decrease their latency. Now, from my testing, I didn't really feel a difference with the switch's performance when this mode was enabled, meaning it's most likely just a sensitivity tweak, especially considering that they say enabling this feature supposedly increases the potential for double clicking according to a tooltip in the driver here. But surprisingly, over my testing, I didn't run into any double clicking issues, but keep an eye out for such issues if you choose to utilize the speed algorithm here. And another cool attention to detail about this feature is that it can be toggled per click, which is a nice thing to see, and we'll go over how to tweak and apply this setting later in this video. And lastly, the main click switches inside the Thorn are soldered to the daughter PCB, meaning they're not hot swappable, but you can solder in new optical switch types into the mouse if you want to, but since the switches are surprisingly well implemented and have such a long cycle rating, I don't think you'll find the need to do so over the lifespan of the mouse. For the Thorn V2's side buttons, this is one aspect of the mouse that's a bit underwhelming unfortunately, as while the switches are well implemented and do give the buttons a good click feel, the implementation of the buttons themselves is a little underwhelming. Now before we talk about the buttons themselves, I wanted to highlight that the buttons have been adjusted slightly coming from the V1, as due to the longer shell and forward balancing range, the buttons are centered roughly around the mouse's 68mm mark towards the lower edge of the mouse's 65 to 75mm balancing range, which is a great attention to detail as it makes it very easy to utilize the buttons due to their improved positioning. For the buttons themselves, they have the expected pill-like shaping, which is slightly angled forward to match the top shell's curvature, and they have a rather rounded surfacing. Another notable aspect of the buttons is their pronouncedness, as they are the tallest side buttons I've seen on a mouse in recent memory, which makes them very easy to utilize, but unfortunately this does come at the cost of giving the buttons a little bit more wobble than expected, but we'll talk more about this in a moment. Circling back to the button's surface, unlike most side buttons nowadays who have a slightly rounded or flattened surface, the roundness of the buttons here is much more pronounced, being similar to the roundness of Pulsar's side buttons, which unfortunately makes their surface a little bit tricky to grip at some angles as they can be quite slippery, and the button's gripability is further worsened by a lack of a coating on them, as the button surface is raw plastic, which to be fair does have a slight granularity to it, but it's not enough to make the buttons grippable unfortunately. And for audio feedback, here's a quick sound test of the Thorn V2's side clicks. Inside the mouse, LAMZU is using two TTC 160 series micro switches, which are similar in design to the TTC brown shell blue dot version of the 160 series switches we've seen used in Pulsar and G-Wolf's mice, but with some slightly different specs, as these switches are rated for an actuation weight of 80 plus minus 10 gram force and the typical cycle rating of 3 million cycles, the same cycle rating found in the other versions of this switch. But despite the advertised actuation weight here, the side buttons do feel a little lighter on my Thorn V2 unit, feeling more akin to a 75 5-gram actuation weight, which while being heavier than the main clicks isn't by a significant margin enough to adversely affect the mouse's click feel in my opinion, as they're still relatively well balanced. For stabilization, and as mentioned earlier, due to the side buttons' larger sizing and their shaping, both side buttons have okay stabilization as long as they're actuated at their mid region, but if the buttons are actuated on their edges, they do have a more pronounced degree of wobble than I expected, which does impact their usage slightly, but not enough to impact their performance per se. They also have a fairly well-sized gapping between them, which is nice to see, but due to their larger size, if you press on their inner edges, it is still quite easy to accidentally actuate the opposite button due to their taller nature, but given the button's larger size and considering you won't be clicking them on their inner edges most of the time, this isn't the biggest issue, but LAMZU could easily resolve this issue by widening the gap slightly, which hopefully they do in their future releases. For travel, both side buttons have a low degree of both pre and post travel, as even with heavier actuations, the side buttons don't sink into the shell as side buttons commonly do, the only exception to this being if you click on their inner or outer edges because that causes the extra wobble, but aside from that, when combined with the side button switch's decent rebound, both buttons are surprisingly responsive and decently spammable, but not to the same degree as the main clicks are. And in terms of serviceability, the side button switches here on the V2 are soldered to a tiny daughter PCB here, meaning that they're not hot swap, but if needed you could solder on a new switch to this PCB as long as it has the same pins and dimensions, or you can replace the PCB entirely due to its modular design. But overall, while the side buttons on paper have a good design, the lack of coating in the rounded surface of the buttons does impact their gripability and gives them more wobble than expected, and as such, on future LAMZU releases, I'd love to see them use the same button design but one that has a flattened surface and has more support in the button's edges to prevent the wobbling, and a proper coating applied to their surface, as with those adjustments the side buttons would genuinely be at 10 out of 10 in my opinion. For the scroll wheel, while the wheel is the traditional plastic typing with a thick rubber texturing wrapped around it, unlike the more traditional texturings you see used on other scroll wheels, the Thorn and LAMZU's other mice apparently feature a unique raised figure 8 or infinity-like symbol on its surface, and due to its raised nature, it's actually quite grippable, which makes the wheel easy to grip and utilize. Another nice attention to detail here is that the wheel is quite pronounced on the mouse's top shell, even though it looks shallow from the left side of the shell. From the right, you can see just how tall it is, and this pronouncedness allows the wheel to have the standard scroll range of 10 steps and further improves its usage experience. Inside the mouse, instead of using a traditional mechanical encoder type that's been used on the vast majority of gaming mice, LAMZU has opted to utilize an optical encoder, specifically the Reisha E9. Now, Reisha, historically speaking, offers switches, encoders, and other components that are eerily similar to the components used in Razer's products. Now, I'm not going to comment on the supposed relationship here, but you could put two and two together pretty easily, and as such, and unsurprisingly, this encoder feels and performs nearly identically to the Razer branded optical encoder found in the Death Adder and Viper V4 Pros. Now, those of you watching the channel for a while now know I have a lot of gripes with mechanical encoders, as my experience with them has been less than ideal due to repeated QC and durability issues. This is why I praise mice use optical encoders so highly, as not only do they offer improved performance, they're also astronomically more reliable, though they do come at the cost of increased power draw due to their optical nature. And for audio feedback, here's how the E9 encoder sounds. Now, you're probably wondering, if these encoders are so good and perform so well, why isn't everyone using them? Well, to simply put it, the main reason is cost, as due to their optical design, they're more expensive than mechanical encoder types, and they're also harder to implement properly, hence why many brands opt to use cheaper encoder types in their products, which has led to the aforementioned numerous issues, many of which I've ranted many times about here in previous reviews. As such, I'm extremely happy to see that LAMZU opted to use the higher quality and more expensive encoder type here, and to their credit, its implementation is pretty much perfect, as it gives the scroll wheel the expected medium scroll force, but it has rather pronounced scroll points, which allows the wheel to be easily utilized but controlled enough where you won't experience accidental scrolling when wheel clicking. And speaking of the wheel click, inside the mouse, LAMZU is using a full-size 1.0 black shell yellow dot switch, which is a welcome sight, as traditional switch types like this one offer better and more consistent performance compared to the pillar switches that have been adopted by a significant portion of the peripheral market. For the switch's specs, this yellow dot switch is rated for an actuation actuation weight of around 60 grams and a cycle rating of around 20 million, which is much better than the 3 to 5 million cycle rating often found on pillar switch types. But as expected, due to the tensioning of the encoder and how the wheel is installed in it, the actuation weight of the wheel is heavier than the factory spec, feeling more akin to a 75 to 80 gram actuation weight on my unit, being slightly heavier than the side buttons, but this is typical for a wheel click, and despite its heavier actuation weight, it still has a better click feel than pillar switch types. And for rebound, since the switch is full size, the wheel click has a surprisingly snappy rebound to it, not to the same extent as the main or side clicks, but it's much snappier than that of pillar switch types, and it also lacks the spongy click feel commonly associated with those switches. And for audio feedback, here's how the scroll wheel click on the Thorn V2 sounds. But just like all the other components inside the mouse, the wheel click switch and encoder are soldered to the main PCB, meaning they're not hot swap, but if needed you could solder and replace the components or replace the entire PCB due to its modular nature. But overall, I'm very impressed with the scroll wheel implementation here on the Thorn V2, as this is all honesty the golden standard for gaming mice in my opinion, and hopefully we'll see this optical encoder return on LAMZU's future releases given its great performance and feel. Now aside from the scroll wheel's great component implementation here, I also wanted to mention that it does support a scroll wheel B-hop mode which you can configure via the WebDriver, and you could adjust what scroll direction causes this mode to be enabled, and you can also adjust the response time from 200 to 1000 milliseconds. Now since I don't use this feature, I can't really speak to its quality and how it's implemented compared to other mice that support it, but regardless I'm happy to see it supported here as not too many mice actually support B-hop modes on their scroll wheels. Moving on to sensor and MCU, LAMZU is advertising that the Thorn V2 is utilizing the Pawn Next 1 sensor, but as expected, this is just a renamed PixArt SKU, specifically a renamed 3955 sensor, just like the Core 1 sensor that was used in the VAXI mel0n SV3. But before we talk about the sensor's updated specs and features, we have to quickly talk about its altered and improved positioning that I mentioned earlier. Firstly, the sensor has been moved forward, resting roughly around the mouse's 71mm mark, positioned just above the mid-range of the mouse's 65 to 75mm balancing range. Secondly, its position has been moved rightwardly by a few millimeters, and this adjusted positioning is a great attention to detail as its forward nature slightly increases the mouse's speed while also accounting for the extended length, while the slightly rightward position helps to align the sensor with the midline of your hand, preventing that disjointed, off-center feeling often found in other ergo mice's sensor positions. Moving on to the sensor's specs, starting off with DPI, the 3955 series sensors support a range of 1 to 50,000, and the DPI is adjustable via 1 DPI step throughout the entire range, and the DPI can also be split on the sensor's X and Y axis if needed. And for IPS, the sensor is rated for 880, and for acceleration it's rated for 80. For LOD, unlike the 3950 series sensors which only supported 3 LOD levels, the 3955 supports 5 levels, 0.7, 1, 1.3, 1.5, and 1.7mm steps, which is a great improvement that allows for more accurate LOD tuning compared to the previous generation PixArt sensors. This sensor also supports motion sync, ripple, and angle snapping, all of which are disabled by default and can be enabled via the mouse's driver. The mouse also supports sensor tilting and has the expected 60-degree total range, 30 degrees left and right, which is great to see as this particular feature is very underrated. And if you want to learn more about what these various sensor features do, which ones you should and shouldn't use, or just want to learn more about how the sensor tilting can significantly improve your performance and aiming consistency, check out my ultimate guide to sensor tilting and mouse settings, which will be linked on screen and down in the video description. And lastly, the sensor also supports an optional turbo mode, which I would recommend against using as it's pointless on high-end hardware, but to my surprise, the Thorn V2 also features a competition mode, which is actually very well implemented, but we'll talk more about this feature in a moment. Now, LAMZU is also advertising that their sensor features dynamic surface calibration as a special feature, but this feature is just a default feature baked into all of PixArt sensors, though notably it's been improved coming from the 3950 series sensors, meaning that the 3955 will properly track on essentially every pad type, and over my testing I used both my Thorn V2s on several types of soft and hard pad types, and I didn't run into any tracking or other sensor related issues over my testing. And for MCU, just like the Death Adder V4 Pro, the Thorn V2 is utilizing the Nordic NRF54H20, which is the higher power version of the NRF54L15 MCU we've seen utilized in several mice lately. But despite despite its high power nature, it still offers significantly improved power efficiency compared to the last gen 52 series SoCs, resulting in vastly improved runtimes here. But notably, this MCU, unlike the other 54 series SoCs, does have a USB controller built into it, and as such it natively supports 8K polling on both its connectivity types, making the Thorn V2 the first LAMZU product to support dual 8K, and we'll talk more about the mouse's polling rates and the implementation in a couple minutes. And lastly, inside the new receiver, as expected, it's also supporting a Nordic 54H20 MCU to pair with the one inside the mouse, which allows for the aforementioned performance improvements to apply to the receiver here as well, which is great to see. Now, just to talk more about the mouse's competition mode for a moment here, this is a feature I didn't know LAMZU supported on their products, but it's a welcome sight to see, as this mode is a great way of fully utilizing the Thorn V2's updated hardware. Now, you can think of this mode as being similar to the high-speed modes found on other mice, as when enabled, it removes many of the power-saving restrictions applied to the sensor during normal wireless use, which allows the sensor to draw more power, mimicking how the sensor would perform when the mouse is used via its wired connectivity. Now, this overall improves the mouse's performance, but specifically the sensor's performance and responsiveness. However, Sentis mode deactivates the power saving restrictions, enabling it does significantly impact the mouse's runtimes due to the additional power draw, and we'll talk more about how much of an impact this competition mode has on the mouse's runtimes in a few minutes. Now, to be clear, with the competition mode disabled, the mouse is still usable for gaming and will have much longer runtimes, but if you want the best possible performance out of the Thorn V2 and its updated sensor, I'd highly recommend enabling the competition mode when gaming, even though it reduces the mouse's runtimes. Now, normally you have to manually toggle this competition mode on and off via the mouse's WebDriver, but as it turns out, you can rebind the base DPI button to toggle the mode on and off, and as such, I highly recommend rebinding the button here, as it makes enabling or disabling the competition mode much simpler. But as I mentioned earlier, currently there's no indication as to whether the competition mode is enabled on the mouse or the dongle, but hopefully in the future, LAMZU updates the dongle and or the mouse to show whether it's enabled or disabled. Moving on to connectivity types, as is typical for most gaming mice nowadays, the Thorn V2 supports 2.4 GHz wireless and wired USB-C connectivity types. But as mentioned earlier, LAMZU has updated both the receiver and the mouse's antennas to a dedicated typing, which is a fantastic change, as this antenna type offers superior performance and interference resistance when compared to traced or inlaid antenna types, which are the antenna types you'll find utilized on the vast majority of gaming mice, and hopefully on LAMZU's future releases we'll see them continue to implement these dedicated antenna types. And as I talked about in the previous segment, since the mouse is using the Nordic NRF54H20 MCU, unlike the Thorn V1 which used the Nordic NRF52840 MCU and was thusly capped to 4 and 1 GHz on its connectivity types due to the limitations of this SoC, since the 54H20 SoC has a built-in USB controller, the Thorn V2 is the first LAMZU product to feature dual 8K polling, supporting 500Hz to 8000Hz report rates on both connectivity types, which is a fantastic improvement coming from the V1. And to my surprise, the polling rate implementations on both the mouse's connectivity types are very good, and I didn't run into any issues with any of the mouse's polling rates or connectivity types over my testing period on either of my Thorn V2 units. For battery, the retail version of Thorn V2 supports a larger battery type than what we commonly see paired with a 54 series SoC, being a 300 mAh type, not a 200 or 250 mAh type that we commonly see, and the type that was used inside the pre-production unit. But personally speaking, I actually prefer the larger capacity typing here, as even though it adds slightly more weight to the mouse compared to a smaller battery, the larger capacity allows for extended runtimes, which is a worthwhile trade-off in my opinion. Now, interestingly, LAMZU isn't advertising any runtimes for the mouse on its product page, as the only estimates I could find were on the back of the box, where they list the runtime to be between 20 and 80 hours, which is oddly on the low end for a mouse using a 3955 and a 54 series SoC, at least compared to the runtimes of other mice with similar specs. Now, measuring the runtimes of my retail batch Thorn V2 set to its maximum DPI of 50K and running firmware version 0.0.1.12 and set at a mouse jiggler to simulate constant usage. On 1 GHz polling with the speed algorithm enabled, the mouse's runtime was approximately 88.23 hours. On 1 GHz again, but with the comp mode enabled and the click algorithm disabled, the mouse's runtime dropped to 31.67 hours. And on 1 GHz again with the comp mode plus the 20K FPS mode, the mouse's runtime dropped again to around 30.27 hours. On 2 GHz polling with the comp mode enabled, the mouse's runtime was around 29.63 hours. Whereas on 4 GHz polling with the comp mode enabled again, the mouse's runtime dropped to to around 23.79 hours, and lastly on 8K Hz with the comp mode enabled, the mouse's runtime was 18.25 hours. Now, while these runtimes are somewhat similar to what was advertised in the back of the box, keep in mind that most of the runtimes here were measured with the competition mode enabled, meaning that if it's disabled, the mouse's runtimes will be longer, as seen when comparing the 1K Hz runtimes. But that said, for a mouse that's using a 300 mAh battery and a 54H20 SoC, the runtimes here are similar to that of other mice that utilize similar performance modes and hardware. However, they are on the lower end compared to some other mice, which I assume is due to firmware optimizations. And hopefully in the future, LAMZU can fine-tune the Thorn V2's firmware to further improve its power efficiency and runtimes. Moving on to charging, the mouse charges via its front-facing USB-C port, which is an indented style, which does impact the mouse's usability with some aftermarket cable types, but this is a pretty minimal issue in all honesty, as most of my aftermarket cables worked with the mouse no problem. And lastly, two things I wanted to mention about the battery itself. Firstly, and as mentioned earlier, the battery is positioned closer to the mouse's midline than we commonly see on many mice, meaning that if the battery's position is adjusted or it's replaced with larger or smaller type, the mouse's balancing will be affected, so keep that in mind. And secondly, unlike other brands who've added pull tabs to their battery's adhesives, unfortunately LAMZU hasn't, which makes servicing a Thorn V2's battery rather tricky, and as such on their future releases I'd love to see them add a pull tab to their battery adhesives, as that makes servicing their mice's batteries much easier. For software, the Thorn V2's WebDriver is called LAMZU Aurora, which is rather simplistic in its design, but it is actually very well implemented. Now, to connect your mouse to the driver, you have to navigate to the driver's URL, which will be linked down in the video description, and you can also find it on LAMZU's website. However, you need to use a Chromium-based browser such as Edge or Chrome to access the driver, and once you load onto the web page, you can click the Connect button in the middle, select the mouse from the drop-down menu, and click Connect, and once connected, your mouse should show up in the middle of the window here. But before we talk about the mouse's settings, I wanted to quickly talk about the driver settings first, as at the top right of the page here, there's a connect button, which is used to manually prompt the connection process if it doesn't automatically start when you open the driver. Next, there's a pair button, which shows you how to repair the mel0n dongle. There's also a button to update the mouse's firmware, which is still done manually, not automatically, but the update process is relatively easy, so be sure to check for any available firmware updates when you first access the driver. Next, there's a support button, which opens a small window with a link to the legacy software download page on it. Oddly, despite its naming, the button doesn't link to their actual support page, but I assume proper links will be added on this page soon. And lastly, we have a language button, which is pretty self-explanatory. Alright, that's everything for the driver-specific settings. Now let's talk about the mouse-specific settings, and we can access them by clicking on the mouse in the middle of the page here, which will open up the mouse's driver, and as you can see, it's a single-page layout, which I actually quite like, as some brands' drivers are a little complex, but this is a rather simplistic layout, and it's much easier to understand and configure, so I don't mind it. Starting off with the leftmost section here, we have a macro editor in which you can create and configure macros for the mouse and bind them to any of your mouse's buttons except the base DPI button. Next, we have a customized section in which you can choose the mouse's profile, of which the mouse supports 3. Above that, there's a small readout of the mouse's battery, and in the center of the section here, you can rebind the mouse's buttons. However, there's no option to rebind a button to swap the mouse's profile, which is an odd bind to see excluded here, and hopefully this option is added in the future. And as mentioned earlier, you can also rebind the base DPI button. However, its bindable functions differ from the other buttons slightly, as it can only be rebound to adjusting DPI, LOD, polling rate, or to toggle the mouse's competition mode, which is the setting I'd recommend rebinding the button to, as it makes activating or disabling the competition mode much easier. And at the bottom of this section, we have toggles for motion sync and the aforementioned competition mode, as well as the main clicks debounce filter setting, which is adjustable from 0 to 15 milliseconds and is defaulted to 0 milliseconds. Next, there's a button to repair the mouse to the dongle, which has the same instructions that were listed in the pair section of the driver we talked about a moment ago. And lastly, there's also a button to factory reset the mouse. Circling back to the top of this section of the driver, there's also a toggle for the 20K FPS mode, which you can utilize if you want, but there's no real tangible benefit to this feature on mice that support 8K polling, so I'd avoid using this feature and use the mouse's high polling rates instead, as they actually improve the mouse's performance compared to this mode. And in the top left there is an advanced button, which if you click will replace this middle menu with a subsection selection menu, which houses the optional buttons for the scroll wheel's B-hop mode and the main click speed algorithm we talked about earlier. And moving on to the last section of the driver, here we can adjust the number of DPI levels from 1 to 5 and set the DPI of each level between 1 and 50k, and as mentioned earlier, the DPI can be split on the X and Y axis, which is a great feature to see. You can also click the colored box next to this section to adjust the color of the DPI level, which will be reflected by the LED indicator on the side of the mouse. We can also adjust the mouse's polling rate in this section, and as mentioned earlier, on both connectivity types, the report rate can be set to 50, 1000, 2000, 4000, or 8000 Hz. Below the polling rate options, we have toggles for ripple and angle snapping, as well as the dongle's LEDs, and you can click the setting button next to this option here to adjust the behavior of the dongle's LEDs between the various settings we talked about earlier. Next, we can adjust the LOD between 0.7, 1, 1.3, 1.5, and 1.7mm levels, and under this we can adjust the mouse's auto sleep timer for 1 to 25 minutes. And lastly, we have the sensor's angle tuning setting here, which has a 60-degree total range, 30 degrees positively and negatively, which is a great feature to see here and one that you should absolutely try if you haven't already, as I talked about earlier. Moving on to repairability, the Thorn V2, despite the slightly more complex internal design, is surprisingly serviceable, as opening the mouse is pretty easy, though you will need to remove the stock skates to do so. Once inside, the task skeleton structure is relatively easy to remove once we pop the main clicks out of the shell, though the front areas are a little bit tricky to work with, but with enough fidgeting, the central cage structure slides out of the top shell relatively easily. And on this central task skeleton or cage structure, we can access both the daughter PCBs pretty easily, but as mentioned earlier, since all their components are soldered, you can't replace any of them without some soldering, but in the event you need to replace the PCBs due to their modular nature, their components, or their ribbon cables, it'll be fairly easy to do so. However, I did want to note, the plastic used in the top shell and central cage-like structure is a bit fragile on my units, meaning it's very easy to strip the pilot holes if you're not careful, so be mindful of this if you plan on opening the Thorn V2, but despite this, the Thorn V2 is a decently serviceable product, and if you want to learn more about how to service the mouse, or just want to learn more about its individual component weights or modding options, get subscribed so you don't miss the Thorn V2's teardown video. Moving on to the Thorn V2 stock skates, as I mentioned earlier, to my surprise, these skates are very good, as they're quite similar to the stock skates Vax used on the MPO1S V3, and compared to the V1, the skate design of the V2 has changed significantly, as the V2 uses a more traditional skate design and style, which is a very good change in my opinion, as it allows the mouse to use larger surface area skates and makes the V2 universally compatible with all aftermarket skate types, unlike the V1. Now, out of the box, and as mentioned earlier, the mouse comes with half-size skates pre-installed on its base and includes an extra set of full-size skates and a sheet of 20 dot skates. Now, all the stock skates are made of PTFE material, but notably, the half-size and full-size skates are a layered typing, which, as I just mentioned, are nearly identical to the style of skates used in the MPO1S V3, which is a great improvement as the inner layering prevents the skates from collapsing over use, giving them more consistent surface area, resulting in improved performance and slightly improved degrees of physical and audio feedback, whereas the dot skates, since they're a single layer typing and don't have any filling or buffering layer on them, perform as expected for a small PTFE dot skate, but they're not as good as the layered skates in my opinion. And as mentioned earlier, all the mouse's stock skates come with a blue protective film installed over their surface, so be sure to remove it before use. Now, due to the layered design and similarity to the same skates used on other mice, unsurprisingly the half-size and full-size skates perform very well on soft pad types, but notably the full-size skates also perform surprisingly well on hard pad types, which is something I didn't exactly expect. However, due to their softer PTFE material, the skates don't have the best durability, especially if they're used on hard pad types, which is the pad type I mainly use. And as such, after I tested all the stock skates, I removed them in favor of using hard pad optimized aftermarket skates, and the process of removing the stock skates is very easy, as there are skate removal ramps on the top and bottom skates, but also the sensor ring, which is a small feature I wish more brands would adopt. And due to the improved skate channel, since they were wider and thinner typing, the mouse is compatible with all types of aftermarket skates, which is a great improvement coming from the V1. However, while the mouse comes with great stock skates and the mouse's skate channels have been improved significantly, one critique I have here is that the mouse doesn't include any hard pad optimized skates, which is very disappointing considering how common hard pad types have become. And if LAMZU were to swap the sheet of 20 PTFE dots to a buffered UHMWPE typing, that'd be a great improvement to see, compatibility, and hopefully this is a change LAMZU will implement on their future releases. But despite the lack of hard pad optimized skates, the stock skates on the V2 are solid and will perform great on every soft pad type, but if you're going to use a hard pad like I do, I would recommend getting more durable aftermarket skates with the best experience here. Personally speaking, I use the X-Ray Pad U9 Air 8mm dots and the X-Ray Pad Obsidian Air 9.5mm dots over my testing, and they were both fully functional with the Thorn V2 and drastically improved the mouse's usage on hard pads. And lastly, for stock cable, the V2, as I mentioned earlier, includes a rather familiar cable typing, being a thicker, more rigid style due to its internal shielding, which has the expected USB A to C ends. But notably, unlike most mice's stock cables, the USB-C end of this cable here is tilted, which is a great feature to see. Now, for those of you who've used Pulsar's Crazy Light series mice, this cable will be very familiar as it's the exact same type and even shares the same packaging. However, this means it also shares the same lackluster usage experience, as while the cable is great for wireless usage due to its shielding, for wired use its thickness and more rigid nature makes utilizing the mouse's 8K polling less than ideal, as movements become quite heavy and rather inconsistent as you have to fight against the cable when moving the mouse. The cable's thickness also makes it incompatible with mouse bungees, meaning that the paracord wrapping can make contact with the mousepad surface, which can cause further inconsistency due to drag on some pad types. As such, and as I've said countless times, if a brand is going to ship a mouse with dual 8K polling, they need to include a cable type that's optimized for wired usage, but given the numerous hoops brands have to jump through when it comes to certifications, I understand why they went with this cable design, but I still wish they included another, more optimized cable type here for wired usage. As such, if you plan on getting the Thorn V2 and plan on utilizing its 8K wired polling, I would highly recommend investing in a good quality aftermarket cable type, as they significantly improve the mouse's wired usage experience, but due to the recessed nature of the mouse's USB-C port, some aftermarket cable types might not work, so be sure to check for compatibility before you purchase an alternate cable type. Alrighty, in closing, overall I am incredibly impressed with the Thorn V2, as the mouse is well priced, comes in great packaging and includes solid accessories. The updated orbital receiver is a great thing to see, though it does need some tweaks and additional features. The mouse's build quality and QC is superb on both of my units, and the addition of the task skeleton is a great thing to see as it gives the mice fantastic shell rigidity. The mouse's weight and balancing is very good, and the shape, while being a unique type for an ergonomic mouse, is very well designed and feels great to use, being the closest analog to the legendary Outside X shaping I've used to date. The mouse's coating is S tier, being one of the best coatings I've used this year, and the stock grips, while they're a bit underwhelming, are still a nice accessory to see included here. The main side clicks and scroll wheel are all well implemented, specifically the scroll wheel though due to the addition of the optical encoder, which as we talked about earlier performs astronomically better than the more traditional mechanical encoder types. The 3955 sensor is also well implemented and its performance is further improved by the optional competition mode. The updated dedicated antenna typings is a great improvement to see, and the mouse's connectivity types and dual 8K polling rates are very well implemented to my surprise. The mouse's runtimes are okay, but if you use the competition mode they will be heavily reduced, so keep that in mind. And despite the more complex internal structure, the mouse is decently serviceable. The redesigned skate channels are a significant improvement coming with the Thorn V1 and allows the mouse to be universally compatible with all aftermarket skate types, and the stock half-size and full-size layered skates perform amazingly, though I wouldn't recommend using them on hard pad types due to their softer material. However, the mouse isn't perfect, as it doesn't include any recycling or disassembly instructions. Some features of the updated receiver are a bit laggy and it's missing some key features, and its light are a bit dim on my units. The stock grip aids, aside from the lackluster performance, lack universal hump or side button covers, and they're not a modular typing. The side button shaping is too rounded and they lack a coating, which makes them a bit slippery to use. They also have a bit more wobble than expected, and their gapping is also slightly too thin in my opinion. The plastic used in the top shell and the internal skeleton is a bit brittle, meaning it's very easy to strip the mouse's pilot holes when servicing the mouse, and the mouse doesn't include any hard pad optimized skates. Personally speaking, I would have rather seen the sheet of PTFE dots be a UHMWPE type, as that would improve the mouse's hard pad usage significantly. The battery's adhesive lacks a pull tab, which makes it difficult to service, and the mouse's stock cable, while fine for wireless mouse usage isn't the best for wired use due to its thick, rigid nature, and it makes utilizing the mouse's wired 8K polling rather difficult. But despite these issue areas, many of which can be resolved with some firmware tweaks or updates to future batches, the Thorn V2 is still a mouse I'm very impressed with, not only because the shape is essentially a slightly larger outside AX, but also due to the improved specs, as it has essentially the same specs as my current main, the DeathAdder V4 Pro, but in a much better shaping in my opinion. As such, and as I hinted at the beginning of this video, while the mouse isn't perfect, the Thorn V2 has impressed me so much it's actually dethroned the DeathAdder V4 as my main mouse, ending its roughly year-long reign, and I'm very keen on seeing what LAMZU cooks up next, as refreshes of the other mice with the same specs and features as the Thorn V2 here, just with a couple fixes, would be very solid releases, but we'll have to wait and see what's next for LAMZU, and I will definitely be keeping a very close eye on their future releases, and hopefully they won't elude me like they have before. But with that, that's everything for today's episode of the mel0n Review. Thank you very much for watching, and thanks again to LAMZU for sending the Thorn V2 over for review. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like, get subscribed, and share the video with a friend who's looking for a new ergo mouse. And if you want to directly support my efforts making these super in-depth reviews and supporting the Teardown project and everything else I do here on the channel, consider becoming a member, as that is the best way to directly support everything I do, and being a channel member also gives you ad-free early access to all upcoming content. So if you want to support what I do here, consider becoming a channel member today. Thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n Review. Peace.